change. So we continue their vision and we work very much with families to empower them to speak up for children. We also like to speak to others like yourselves and to share the experiences and knowledge that we bring and to try and influence policy. In talking with the Centre for Excellence about this presentation, one of the points that was made to me was about the different languages in various sectors, and that disability has its own language, and that child and family services have its own language, and that perhaps I'm a little bridge between the two. I have been a foster carer for the past 15 years, and I'm a permanent carer of 2 adolescent boys, and my older son has an intellectual disability. I like to think of myself as having a master's in trauma-informed practice, but only through placement. I haven't written any essays. But when we talk about behaviour in the disability sector, we've got our own language and terminology that we like to use. We talk about complex behaviour support needs, behaviours of concern, meltdowns where a young person is so overwhelmed by all of the sensory input and demands put upon them that they are not able to self-regulate. Families tend to talk about challenging behaviour. But at the heart of our practice and our understanding is that behaviour is a form of communication. And I think this is very in common with trauma-informed practice. That the young person has something to say, and this is how they're saying it. But what it can mean and what they're trying to express can be wide and varied and difficult to work out. I will make a particular point around being in pain. For a young person who is non-verbal, it is very difficult to articulate what is wrong. There is a Disability Royal Commission going on at the moment. There were hearings in New South Wales last week that really highlighted the failures of the health system to respond to the needs of people with disability. People with intellectual disability die on average 30 years younger than their counterparts, without actually having any underlying health issues that are different. The health system struggles to listen and to understand and to respond to what people with disability are trying to communicate. And in relation to behaviour, we will always say in our work with families and in our advice to services is, particularly if there has been a spike and a sudden increase in behaviour, to always look whether there is an underlying health issue, and that a brief visit to the GP is probably not going to actually unpack that enough. In terms of the types of disability where behaviours of concern are more prevalent, I'm sure this is nothing new to you, but it is of higher prevalence within people with autism and intellectual disability, and that those disabilities are the highest occurring disabilities. The behavioural issues are more common in boys. I didn't really feel that I necessarily needed to highlight this point, but I do want to make it very clear that, of course, this is not true of all people with autism and intellectual disability. People with disability are as diverse as all young people. But you work in the complex picture of families and all of the, the intersections of things that are going on within family life. And these are some that I would like to highlight. There is very clear evidence that young people with autism and intellectual disability have significantly higher rates of mental health issues. Alongside that, they find it much harder to access mental health support. There are increased rates of family violence in homes where there are children with disability. Mothers of children with disability have much poorer mental health. Aboriginal young people experience disability at a higher rate, and children with disability are overrepresented in out-of-home care. And all of this sits within the context of our community attitudes towards disability. This was some groundbreaking research done by Professor Anne Kavanagh at the University of Melbourne last year, with a wide-scale community survey around our attitudes towards people with disability, which really show that actually the majority of us are unsure how to act towards a person with disability and uncomfortable having that conversation about, well, what support services, what supports do you need to be able to access this service? I think this is something we see in our everyday work. We speak to families who are desperate about their child's mental health and who've reached out, they've attempted to organise counselling to access services like that, and repeatedly hear, oh, sorry, we can't work with a young person with autism. We don't know how. I can tell you there's not a plethora of counsellors out there that do know how, and that just really limits what is available to families. So in terms of the experience for families, for some, when they are having family adolescent violence in the home, it in fact has been a decade or so longer experience of really difficult behaviour with that child. And probably they're exhausted, I think it's fair to acknowledge. So the child, right from a very young age, may have found it really difficult to self-regulate their own emotions. They may have acted aggressively towards others and towards other children. They may have a very rigid sort of viewpoint and approach to life, and if things aren't in that exact way, they really struggle to cope with that. There is definitely a connection between autism and sleep issues. It doesn't particularly seem to be an issue for the autistic person. It's an issue for the family around them. But this can mean that by the time a child reaches adolescence and they're bigger and stronger, that behaviours in fact have been there for a very long time and are very entrenched. For others, it is quite a sudden sort of turn on at puberty and can often come as quite a shock to a family. They're often quite aware that other families have been having behavioural issues for a very long time and perhaps felt like, well, that hasn't been my child. And then things can really escalate quite quickly, particularly with puberty and particularly with the transition to secondary school. This would obviously come as no surprise that mothers and younger siblings are generally the target. But today is about putting young people at the centre. And so I want to talk about Joe. And Joe is 15. He has level 3 autism and intellectual disability. He has an NDIS plan, but there are no services in place at this point. Organising the services for an NDIS plan is a part-time job for women. I cannot emphasise the work involved in getting actual supports in place with a plan. So at the moment, Joe attends a special school. Because he's at a special school, that means he's picked up by the school bus and driven to school. While he only lives 20 minutes from school, it's an hour-long journey as they wind around picking up other students. And the school has a rule of no device use on the bus. So Joe spends his hour on the bus. He gets to school. There he is. It's a fairly standard school day. A few particular differences to what you would see in a mainstream school. There's certainly no access to career education. Any form of work experience is done within the school library. There's no access to things like VET programs or any hands-on learning. At the end of the day, Joe jumps on the bus and travels the hour home. When he gets home, he's simply waiting for mum and dad to get home from work. And when they get home, it's into the evening sort of routine. Joe would have a fairly explosive, violent outburst a couple of times a week, and particularly targets mum. And that is where that family is sitting right now. But when I think about Joe and his life, and I think about my two sons, my 14-year-old and my 15-year-old, there is a huge difference. I'm convinced my children spend their entire trip to school playing on their phones, and they seem to spend a disproportionate amount of time at Macca's and KFC after school. They have sporting commitments, they go around to mates, they're ringing up and trying to organise some deals for some second-hand Lego. They both have a part-time casual job. But actually, I think we know that for adolescents, it is that after-school time that is where you get to express freedom and independence, some choice. And Joe's life looks nothing like that. So what works? What could change that situation for Joe and for his whole family? Well, ultimately, we do know that we have to address the cause of behaviour. I think that's been a really common theme throughout today. There has to be some enjoyment in Joe's life. There's got to be some things that maximise freedom and choice. Dignity of risk is a really strong concept within disability. And this is from adults with disability having lived the experience where really they have perhaps been denied that through their own growing up. That I think we often have quite a protective, paternalistic approach to young people and children with disability, and therefore they don't get to test those boundaries, make mistakes. I think probably all of us did some things in our teenage years that we perhaps later regret or think, I wouldn't do that again. They're perhaps not even given the opportunity to make those mistakes. I must admit there are times I do just sit on the train repeating to myself, dignity of risk, it's going to be okay. The other thing that does work is explicit teaching, that the interactions between people, the rules, the concept, the flow, when you're attracted to someone, how do you behave? These things can be and have to be explicitly taught, that not everyone gets them. And I think that, to be honest, is true of people with disability and without. So there needs to be a very concerted conversation with young people about what the social rules are. What works for families? Practical steps and behaviour support plans. Behaviour support plans do work. They focus on the most challenging, concerning behaviour. You're never going to address everything. You've got to go to the behaviour of highest risk. And really helping the family put in place some practical steps around that. Identifying triggers, what can be done to prevent those triggers, what can be done to build enjoyment and freedom, and what is going to be the response when a behaviour of concern does actually happen. I guess one thing I do just have to say about positive behaviour plans is that there is not, again, in terms of workforce, there is not thousands of psychologists out there sort of waiting for families to walk in the door to say, yes, great, I've got loads of time for you, let's develop some positive behaviour plans. This is actually some work that perhaps we all need to be able to have as part of our skill set. Safety planning works, and I think this really talks to the heart of some of the work within family violence. And it can really just help a family shift from feeling out of control and in crisis to feeling like they have a bit of a plan and know what they're going to do. Can I just put in a little sort of recommendation that safety plans are written down? I have had a call from one family to say, I've got a safety plan, but I've forgotten it. I'm so stressed. It does actually need to be something they've got in writing and on the fridge. Peer support works, connecting with other families in the same situation. I think Liana just touched on the shame and the sense of, is this me as a bad parent? And that definitely is how these families are feeling. And being able to connect with and talk to other families that are in a similar situation is a very powerful response. Helping to establish a consistent approach across home and school is really key. And if they're working at cross purposes, nothing is going to work. I guess another element of deep fear and concern for families is, what does the future hold? Is this child going to be living with me for the rest of my life? What is going to happen when I die? These are those types of concerns that do sit close to the heart. And I know, and I am certainly happy to participate in any discussion of the issues concerned with the NDIS. But this is one area where I think the NDIS is slowly opening up opportunities for different forms of independent living for young people with disability. And I think it's one of the great things it is bringing. And so a conversation that talks about this is not for life. There will be other options for your young person that are safe moving forward. We do know very clearly what doesn't work, and that is restrictive practice. But this has probably been the go-to for people with disability for decades. Secluding people with disability into separate spaces, which continues with special schools and with group homes that are effectively resi units for adults with disability. Mechanical restraint, physical restraint where somebody is held down, environmental restraints in group homes, things like kitchens and fridges are often just locked away. People do not have any access to them. So it has been such a huge part of how we as a society have responded to people with disability, and it takes time to really break that down and change our practice. This again is probably another area that the NDIS is leading. The Quality and Safeguards Commission has taken a really strong framework around restrictive practice, that it absolutely needs to be the last resort, that it needs to be the least restrictive possible and for the shortest possible time. And that is changing. It is changing practice. It is changing how people think about what and can be done. So I am going to talk about the NDIS and what it can do and what it can't. Sometimes we've just got to simplify it. The NDIS is actually just money. It can't answer anything else. There is no enormous team of caseworkers sitting in an accessible building in Geelong. It is just money with which people can purchase services. Getting a plan and putting it into place is hard work. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And in fact, all practitioners in the child and family services need to understand the NDIS. This is the biggest social reform of the last 20 years. It is here to stay, and it is now part of the way that we all need to work. I am just going to do a plug here at this point. We have partnered with the Centre for Excellence over the past 12 months to deliver workshops for practitioners around the NDIS and at-risk families. We've delivered something like 30 workshops across Victoria. We do have another 15 coming up, so if you're interested in sort of diving deeper into the NDIS, please let me know. And please look at those and have a go. Ooh, the 5 minutes. I am going to skip over my NDIS sort of 101. And I guess just to be really clear, where a family is in that situation like Joe, where they couldn't put in place any services, things can change. One of the best things to change is to bring in support coordination. Support coordination is a service which helps line up the other services. It is not an automatic part of plans. But if one thing you can do to support a family is to find out whether they've got support coordination or not, and if they don't, then to make sure that is asked for, either as part of an annual review or a plan review, that's really key. You can also be part of giving evidence. I'm aware of a family that asked in their most recent NDIS plan review meeting for positive behaviour support. The young person had broken mum's nose in a violent outburst, but that wasn't enough evidence for the NDIS to fund it. They like pieces of paper. They like things in writing. School reports, police reports are good, but actually you can also write letters on behalf of families saying these are the involvement you've had and the impact that that young person's behaviour is having on the family, and that would be very strong evidence. I'm just going to rush through a couple of very practical resources and go-to places because, you know, we're a family organisation. We're all about, here's a few practical tips. The first is around understanding positive behaviour support. The Raising Children website has some excellent information. It's no more than a page. It is something you can use as practitioner. It is something that families can use. It is specific to behaviour support for children with disability and autism. The Education Department actually has some really quite good positive behaviour support plans. In working with a school, having one template and all using the same document is also really quite useful. I mentioned very briefly sexual behaviours of concern. Family Planning Victoria have very specific resources and information, and that explicit training and support for people with disability in clearly understanding the norms of behaviour. And also disability organisations, our own, and organisations like Amaze, which focus on autism, and CID, which is Council for Intellectual Disability, have also just got some great resources for you. But I am going to finish very briefly with Noah's story. Noah is 15. He has mild cerebral palsy, autism, and intellectual disability. He was born 10 weeks premature. His behaviour, he would always have meltdowns that sort of really, not able to sort of regulate his behaviour through primary school. But in the transition to secondary school, they became much more explosive and really hitting out at mum and his younger sister, who's 5 years younger. Mum works in the prison system and was just absolutely terrified at the thought of the police and the justice system sort of starting to get involved here. Mum reached out and rang a family violence service, and they did a safety plan over the phone and put in place some real key concrete steps that she could take, because Mum knew her biggest concern was her daughter, and she did not want her hurt. And the plan broadly is that if Noah starts to get overly agitated, Olive takes herself upstairs. Olive quite likes to barricade the door and, really kind of get herself set in and comfortable, but whatever, it kind of works. What this has meant is perhaps that absolute heartfelt fear has just lessened a little. Noah has had a couple of explosive outbursts since the safety plan, and what Mum